Formscapes, Flowscapes and Mindscapes. From points to lines and lines to surfaces. Let's get back to the idea of a point. The point is the single unit that we find expressed as a dot when we explore the graphical language, and more generally as a point when it's applied to all the different other fields. We speak of a point of reference, a point of view, a point of escaping point of perspective. So it's a concentrated unit of beingness that appears in the relative emptiness of space, of a background. The point becomes a line when it is put in relation to other points in a continuous sequence. So the line is a whole series of points, or a very stretched point, perceived as a unity. If many completely separate things appear on the field of perception, they would not be thought of or depicted as lines, but as isolated point. The line appears when there is the physical or mental sequence that's perceived connecting these units of beingness. And the line appears as an axis, so either straight or curved or spiraled or any other shape, but connecting all these individual units in a continuity, in a like expanded unit of beingness. The line will create the feeling of a border, or the feeling of a local separation between spaces. There's the inside and outside. More specifically, the inside of a line would refer to a closed space, so a line closing up on itself and differentiating clearly what's inside from what's outside. But relative to point of view, any line will be seen as creating a distinction, a division. Much more so than the point. The point refers, in the way it's perceived, to a single unit of perception that contrasts with the surrounding background, surrounding relative emptiness. Space, if we relate to physical matter or graphical representations. So when we use points for perception or for action, we focalize consciousness, we focalize energy, we focalize ideas or mental constructs on one single unit that's clearly definable and clearly differentiated from its surrounding. When we depict a line, a linearity, we create this continuous sequence of points that relate into a full unity. Practically moving from a point will shift the position of just one element in space relative to all the others that are moving not at all or much less. If I move an axis, so if I move a line or a segment, then it's very different. Say, if I take my arm like this and I just move my fist, front, back, up, down, you'd see that it moves relative to the entire sequence of joints, bones and whatnot. It will make the entire line of my forearm move because it's linked to it. It obviously creates a line of its own. But if I move only my wrist, for instance, you could see that it will affect the shape. It will affect the shape of the line, but not move really the entire line, especially if I make the movement smaller. If I move the entire axis, rotating it, everything moving together, I move a full, complete set of points all at the same time, or I move the felt feeling of this stretched unity, this point that's stretched in a line, and I move it as a unit. I could move my arm with the feeling of having just my fist drive forward and drag the inner parts of my body behind. So that would be a feeling of moving a point that's dragging a line. Or I could get the feeling of using every single unit of beingness in this sequence, and move them all together, which would prove much more powerful if you used it in, say, for a push or strike or something like this. You add vector forces. Similarly, you could get in between both and have the feeling of one point moving, then the next, then the next. So you would have the sequential stretching of the points, creating a line, as though you were drawing the line as you go, as you moved from point to point. This fractal motion of a point moving, another point moving, another point moving in sequence. And you could make these points as close and as numerous as you'd like. So you can get the feeling of just moving the extremity. So I stretch this point, then I stretch the feeling of my palm, then the wrist, then say the middle of the forearm, and the inside of my elbow, and I would move 4 or 5 points this way, and I could move them all together, or I could move them in a series, in a sequence, connected together at just the right timing, so that the vector force of one is picked up upon by the next one, instead of the vector force being dissipated and lost, and then the movement starting again, which would be if I started to do this, or starting too late. I start to expand the next point when the first one is slowing down too much. So the first one, instead of adding vectors, the first one is already slowing down. Think of cars. So I could have cars, the first one starting first, giving some space, the second one getting more momentum behind, making room for the third one, and so on. Or I could have one car starting, then stopping a bit later, the second car starting after and being stopped by the first car, and so on. So the idea of a line is to expand the potentiality of points through relationship, and here through sequential relationship. It's all the potentialities that we find with points. So concentrating expanding, distributing. We can reapply them to lines, but with this expanded idea of sequentiality and relationship woven together, like or weaving together this infinite number of points. As we saw before, we can use, for instance, the idea of 1 point to focalize perception, then 2 points, then 3 points, 4 points. If you look at this on a screen, this idea of distributing or fragmenting perception into million points is the basis for the pixel ID. So to recreate the semblance of a picture, the big unit of light reflected, I will create this many points in a screen with these many units of color. So the more variance in color I get, and the more points I can get on the screen, the bigger the definition of the screen will be. So the first definition of the screen is the number of pixels by unit of area. The more pixels I have, the higher definition the screen will have. And then the more units of color I have, the more contrast can be created, or the more nuances can be created. And then you'd have the speed of the sequence. The more pictures per second I can get, the clearer the picture will appear, to a point where it seems, with most of the modern screens, oftentimes the pictures that we see seem more real than reality, which makes them very artificial, very unreal, due to either excessive definition. We lose the blur and the relative silence of actual felt senses, and we get a sequence that's too fast. So this spinning up of the sequence of events, sequence of changes, sequence of perceived beingness is a recurring theme of the modern times that we find with information. We find it with like all the externalization and extension of potentialities and capacities that we call machines, techniques, mechanisms. If I change many things very fast, faster than I can process them, I get to a feeling of unreality or surreality. I get a feeling close to what you could get when you start using what they call subliminal images. You insert images at more than 24 images per second, which is the basic processing for the eye of continuity of movement, and you make other pictures appear as glimpses into these continuous lines of pictures. The continuous lines of pictures will create the feeling of continuous movement, continuous existence of a picture that we use to make animated pictures, for instance. So the same principle applied differently could lead to the use of axis in the body, the use of timelines, the use of lines of perception, stretching one's perception. I can take my view and stretch it forwards, backwards, both directions, sideways, upwards, following axis, and going in one direction or two, and going towards the center or away from the center, as we saw before. When I get to two axes at 90 degrees angle, then I get to expand the surface. So we saw we could use it for distributing. So a contact point is concentrated at the point of contact. I can have a relation to the point that's punctual to. I can react upon contact where it's touched from the point of contact and move it. So I can move it any direction. If I move it forward while the incoming force and the point is going in, it creates a position. I could bounce it if it was a ball. I could receive it if I let go and let the point enter and just remove my mass following the direction. But I can divert it, say the point enters forward like this, and I shift this point of contact upwards, which would be difficult to see but easy to test on yourself, and you get the feeling that this force is deflected. That's basic depiction of it in math is the addition of vectors. So now the vector force is added as the force dives in. Same, I could bring it down so I can stretch towards my wrist and get the feeling that the force goes down, and I could do that at any scale. I could do that with my entire body and get a force, a push or a strike later. Strike obviously is faster, so the sequence of motion that you need to get to move it without creating breaks or creating these small gaps that would allow for walls of compression and transmission of force. Obviously it's a bit harder, it takes a bit more practice. It's exactly the same as a push, and a push you learn from something that's easy for you. You tend to use the 70% principle and start from something that you would manage seven times out of 10, or something that represents only 7 units of difficulty over what you can achieve normally. So you do something that's fairly easy, although slightly challenging, and then from this you expand first consciousness of what's happening. You get the feeling, you get the awareness, you get the continuity of feeling. You fill in the blanks in the units of perception that you have along the pathway, and the units of perception, the units of action that you can mobilize along this pathway. So if you can receive, you get the feeling of shifting your skin backwards, but then you cannot get the feeling when you reach the bone. You'd stop, slow down, or make the pressure lesser, and get the sensation of moving from the skin, then moving from the bone, then moving the point behind and behind and behind. So obviously you're mobilizing many different structures of your body to access these things, which could seem difficult, or even if you've never practiced anything with your body, it might seem completely otherworldly. The idea that you could get the feeling of moving from any point along any line of your body, going inside, going up and down, going sideways, and then in all directions later. But it's really something that's very natural to you, and that will come very fast with practice. The best way to access these skills is not to get the idea that you're missing something. So if you have two ways of perceiving it, you could get the idea that the line of evolution of your skill, or of any attribute, or any experience, or any knowledge, you can get the feeling that you have to add increments of unities, like of points of knowledge, that you're missing at first. You do not have them. You need to piece them, add them, like the pieces of a puzzle. When you complete the puzzle, then you have the skill. So that's one way of looking at it. That's the incremental approach of the linearity of practice. Another way that's complementary and that can be used in a very beneficial manner is the feeling that you already have, like the you that's mentioned is obviously not the tiny you. It's a you as a part of a bubble of the huge infinite field of potentiality, already has anything you might ever need, and all the things that you could develop, but they're blocked. You have something, but you lock it inside so that you cannot access it. So in this way, you're not thinking of all the things you're lacking and all the flaws and defects that prevent you from being whatever you'd want to be. In this idea, it's a bit more than an idea, but in this idea you have everything at hand, but parts of you are locking up or slowing down, putting brakes on some capacities, some abilities, some understandings, for various reasons that could be eventually very, in some ways they could be beneficial for you. It's a different topic, but so here the entire access to this line of development of a skill or of an ability will be finding ways to release these blocks, release these obstacles, or these locks you put on your own infinite capacities. It might seem new agey and whatnot. It doesn't really matter what you think about it. When you train something, you have two ways. Either something is useful at this present moment. If it's not useful, as Bruce Lee used to say, you discard it. But on contrary to what he said, you do not discard, you do not take the card and throw it in the trash bin, or you lose a huge potentiality of progress later on. So at any level of skill, perception, awareness, understanding of any field, there are things that you can access, and there are infinitely many things that you cannot access, you cannot do. they seem completely otherworldly for you. If you discard them because at this present time they're not useful to you or they're not accessible to you, and you just burn the possibility of using them later on, or experimenting with them, or combining them with other things to create new content, then you're impoverishing your practice a lot. So although the line you draw, you may not be able to jump from where you are to where you want to be without filling in the blanks, or without removing the veil that's hiding each point in between. It's still, to my mind, a big mistake would not be the name. Big limitation to see what's not of practical use now as useless. So, what can we do with axis? Obviously, if you find a point in time and you relate it to other points in time in the same space, for instance, you can create timelines. Timelines for a country would be the units of time and the units of memory related to the events happening in the frame of, like, the field of reference that you decide on. Obviously, what you can get from exploring a point in time or a point in space is very different from what you can get from exploring a sequence, a relational sequence, a series of points connected together in a series, especially in a directional series. A unit of track that's found is very different from in what it can give as information, as abilities. It's very different from finding the sequence of tracks that will create the entire line of travel of an animal, for instance. I can find a track and know that at a given time, at this point, one part of an animal imprinted on a substrate, but it's very, very different from having the full story told by the pattern of tracks that's created. And similarly, the story I can weave by piecing together units of events and units of time in a storyline is very different from what I get using just the lived experience of the now. The drawing I can do may be very exquisite, very picturesque and whatnot, but as a mean of conveying stories, it is different from a full sequence of drawings that I can animate by just making them appear in a sequential manner and creating an anime. The line can thus be used to move sequentially. It can be used to move as a unit, a structure. Especially there we arrive at the idea of aligning points. So aligning points is creating a certain pattern of relationality, the most basic one being the straight line. So the straight line can be depicted as what we see when we aim at something. So I will align, say, either my sight, or say I align my nose with one point, and then I align a third point. Misaligned, and when I get aligned, the more aligned they are, the more they'll disappear the one behind the other. If they are the same size, they disappear entirely, and I cannot see the next one. So if I take a volume like this, if I align it completely, say with the camera, it will appear as a surface instead of a volume. If it's not aligned, it's perceived so it could appear even as a dot, and then a surface, and the big dot would be a surface, then a wider surface that would take more angles, and then if you see several planes appear, it would appear visually as a volume. So the use of the line from the point is not just it's not just a figment of the imagination. It's actually a very deep unfolding of new capabilities. The expansion of a point gives rise to the expansion of a line. So the expansion of a line at first is sequentially in its direction, but then the widening of a line, so say I take points in space joined through time, the same point seen a moment, like moments later, I join them in a line. I have the sequence of the pictures that appeared at a given point at different times. And if they're close together, I get a continuous feeling. Although you always need to understand that this continuous feeling is just relative to perception. In the same way, we see the continuous movement on the screen due to the speed of the sequence of pictures. We miss the pictures that are much faster than our ability to process them. We miss the ones that are much slower. And so if my perception of continuity of time is always related, I miss the units that are much smaller than my scale, for instance. Units at the molecular or at units of time at the atomic level are completely lost in between what I perceive as contiguous points of perception. So 2 moments at my scale of organism are filled by an infinity of empty space at lower scales, a scale that is much smaller than the one I can perceive. So in the same way, if I see 2 things side by side, and I've got at my level of perception, I see fullness all along, like I see a full continuation of matter, feeling relative emptiness, feeling space. If I zoom in more and more, at one point I would see an infinity of empty spaces reappearing at another scale. So this is just an interesting point that we find in all the subsequent applications of the forms to the flows, to the shapes movements. When we get to define axes, we can stretch them if they're elastic. Even if they're not elastic, we can actually stretch them, but it's just that it's not, we cannot see it or feel it really, but something's happening. So stretching is I push away, or I draw away 2 points away from each other or away from the center. I can compress by pushing the 2 points towards the center or towards each other. So compression would be slightly different from contraction. Contraction would be the feeling of the 2 points being drawn towards the center from the center. Compression or compulsion would be the feeling of pushing from outside in. If I'm dragging something from the inside, dragging the extremities from the inside as though I had ropes and I was dragging in things from the outside, I would get this feeling of contraction. If I am pushed from the outside, I get the feeling of compression or compulsion. If I extend from the outside, I get the extension. If I push from the inside, I get the feeling of expression or expulsion. Push, pulse would be the same root and would all mean pushing. Press, primo, primere, in Latin would mean the same. Pushing away, pushing from. So the relationality to the center is something important that will tie the points to the lines. There are points in the lines that are very significant. There are lines within the lines that are significant. So the segments inside the line that are significant oftentimes are called proportion or ratio. So they are division of the line. The points that are significant on the line in a line oftentimes are the extremities that define it. They can be the center that balance it or divide it equally, and then they can be any number of significant points that are defined by a general ratio, for instance, or that are existing points. Say you have one city, one concentration of beingness that stands out at one point on a road. So that will be today's part for points and lines. A few things we can do. So the most basic way of evolving capabilities is to start from what you can see, perceive, conceive right now, and expand it until it reaches down the line. It reaches new depth, or it reaches forward, or new elevation, or new dimensions. If you jump from one point to the next without the sequential feeling of this spreading of points into a line, there's always the risk that you lose the sequentiality, you lose the feeling of continuity of the line. So it's very common that in physical or energetic practices, for instance, due to the fact that we jump from one topic, one point of concentration to the next, things are perceived as completely unrelated. They're unrelated, they're unaligned, and they're incoherent. They do not pertain to a whole. That makes sense. Sense being here potentially the direction or meaning or whatnot. So if you want to build up your structure, you need to define your axis from, say, the bottom up. You align one point, then the next, then the next, then the next, and the next. When all points are completely aligned, you can reach some level of balance. It's fairly bit harder on some type of objects. And here, as can be seen, my balance is dynamic too, due to the fact the relationship here is nearly a point linked to a point. So the idea there would be start by using lines in obvious ways. You use say the entire forearm. You see how you can rotate it, move it, get the feeling of the felt sense of moving all points at the same time, or one point, then the next, then the next, then the next. Get the feeling of what you can get when you expand or move one point, and what you can get when you expand and move one point and all the points in between, either all together or in a sequence, trying to maximize this increase of momentum that you can get when you sequence when you time your movements so that all vector forces add and cohere. So you get the feeling of getting a laser beam instead of getting only more dispersed light. And when you start understanding really well what aligning, for instance, can mean physically, then you start to get your alignments at other levels. So physically, you'd get a feel of being aligned. So that's the state aspect. From being aligned, you'd get the feeling of aligning, creating a change that aligns points together. So the easiest axis to play with is the axis defined by the gravity relationship. And it's very easy to create a felt sense of what it is by adding contrast. You bring more weight than you used to, so you put small weight on your head or something a bit bigger than the one I use, and you'd get the feeling if your neck is not aligned with the line of gravity and your head, then any degree of leaning is expended energy to maintain your muscles. Well, if you get to proper alignment, you can get the feeling that all things rest on top of each other. So creating an alignment is an energy movement. So it's a creation of a change. So that's already a feeling of energy. When you get this feeling, you can make it more and more refined and get smaller and smaller feelings. And you can get the feeling, for instance, of shifting from the inside of the spine, point after point. And then you can get the same feeling on the vertical axis of moving weight, moving mass, moving units of matter. Moving mass is the first doorway into what's called later energetics. And energetics is dismissed as bullshit, just simply because it is a jump. So it's depicted as bullshit by people with fairly little practice and or no practice at all, or it's depicted as bullshit because it's not defined. So we don't know what we call energy, we don't feel it, so it's ill-defined, ill-perceived, ill-conceived, and then ill-used or not used. But since you use energy all the time anyhow, it will be ill-used. You use it without consciousness and quite poorly. If you bring interest, curiosity, awareness into things, if you perceive things as non-beings that can be neglected or despised or ignored, then the relationships that you can create or we can create with these things we despise is very, very limited. If someone moves around you and ignores you completely and walks as though you passes through you, obviously there will be precious little beneficial relationship that can be built in between you. The more you imbue something with meaning, value, and like social relationships, so you decide the amount of care and the amount of attention, awareness, consciousness that you imbue into something. If you never look at the clouds are non-existent. There's just a general principle. They're big, so you'll see them, and they will have an existence because you'll feel the rain, or you'll feel something, or you'll have to see a huge dark cloud with lightnings getting close to you. But if the same is seen for very tiny scales of beingness, like tiny insects, if you do not invest your own attention and care into these things, they will nearly not exist for you. Most of our bodies do not exist for us. Most of our capabilities do not exist. We have huge, they're not points of unconsciousness, they're huge territories, they're huge gaps. So many huge lines that lay hidden, that lay obscured and blocked and locked away from our ability to perceive, but then later our ability to use and our ability to interact with. The more you make these points conscious, and the less gaps of unawareness, unattention, uninterest you leave, the more you'll access these continuous lines, and the easier it will be to actually do things with them. It's actually not rocket science, really. You picture an axis, you connect it, you align one axis, whatever it be, whichever it be. You align points on an axis, and you see I can connect the external reference axis with the felt axis inside of you. You can move from an axis by stretching whatever straight piece of wood forward. You grip your fascia. It will move your mass, move your center of mass. If you align your structure, it will move your spine in a straight line. And same, you can turn from the axis. It will stretch your fascia, and it will turn your own central axis. When you're able to do that easily with matter, you do the same with energy. So energy will start from the movement of mass. So it's matter being moved instead of having a rigid line that you move around. You'll create the line at the same time as you move it around as you're creating the line. So you create the line here at the same time as you're stretching it. Instead of having a rigid line that I can move, I will create from something that it's always a line due to the way the body is organized, and create it. But still, the idea is I will align points so that the vector forces concur together. When I can do that, I can do this with deeper feelings of, like smaller feelings of change, smaller units of change. And I can do this with aligning emotions or aligning capabilities. You see these pictures of chakras, for instance. The same. Many people will just throw it directly out because it's called chakras, it's New Agey, whatnot, or it's from backwards times or civilization or whatnot. If you just need to translate, if you are not happy with the term chakras, you pictures functional systems that are located on a vertical axis. So you'd have central nervous system, center at the brain. Then you get the expression, center of expression at throat and mouth and sinus area. You have the center of circulation and so vital processes of getting in and moving air and blood. Then you get down to the belly and you get the center of digestion, storage, and then excretion, and in between you'd have a few others, and then you get to the lower area will be excretion and reproduction, and you move to the extremities where you'd get your basic movement functions. So you can depict all these if you prefer them to chakras, and you can align them, or you can make them coherent, like adding the vectors together, or incoherent. There's a small coherence is still another topic that we'll cover later because it's a slightly more complex shape. But at first, using this idea of straight lines, you get the feeling of what it can be to align your thoughts, your words, your feelings, your emotions, and your matter, your beingness, your body. And in between, if you start to feel what is vitality and energy, your energies. You find that all the time. Walking the talk would be a depiction of aligning what's done by the appendages of my limbs and what's done with my expression center, expressing my ideas, for instance. And these alignments could spread outwards, since what you depict as yourself is just, in some ways, it's always a definition linked to a point of view. What you need to exist as an independent being is not encapsulated in your skin. You're not the skin encapsulated ego. If we make a definition outwards, you'll need the bubble of air that surround you. Then you'll need all the things that create and recycle this bubble of air and move it around so that you have new oxygen to access and clean out the excess carbon dioxide or the excess oxygen for that matter. And same, then what you need to exist as a being will expand to the bacteria, viruses that are autotrophic, the trees being part of it, algae, mostly algal blooms. And then, since these will depend completely on other things, you'll need more and more and more. You'll need all the layers of the earth that protect you from the deadly rays of the sun. You'll need all the sun that protect you from the dead inert stop of action that we would call a complete absolute zero temperature, and so on and so on. So in a logical depiction, you can be seen even in a materialistic frame of mind. You can picture yourself as being a tiny dot in a line at various scales of orders of belonging. If you go the other way down, you exist with your systems, organs, tissues, cells, and symbiotic bacteria and protozoa and whatnot. And it goes down to your molecules, before molecular change, molecules, atoms, quarks and whatnot. And then down and down and down you go into nothingness. So at the same time, you're everything and you're nothing in a logical depiction that you could easily articulate yourself. So when we say you align yourself, you can also align all these mystic things, can be translated even for materialistic modern minds. You can align sky, middle, so beings, life, bodies, earth. And it can be done. You can align future, present, past, or you can misalign them. You can twist them, you can break them, whatnot. So these are just expansions of capabilities. They're the natural inheritance that we have. That's even in plain sight in all the things that surround us and in all the things that comprise us. So the basic idea of the content that I'm trying to articulate slowly here is that even without changing anything, without building up muscle, without becoming more trained into your brain or whatnot directly, you can access huge universes of capabilities just through becoming aware of a few simple possibilities and then practicing them. So eventually you will have to build up the muscle for it, or conversely remove the obstacles that prevent you or prevent us, not at all different from any of you, prevent us from accessing deeper capabilities, both individually and collectively. We can align collectively, horizontally in between ourselves, vertically through scales of structures, and frontally towards a goal, endpoint, destination related to the present time, present place, and to the past, the origin and whatnot. So that's it for now.